Welcome to the Modern Medicine Movement Podcast with Dr. Thomas Hemingway. Have you ever looked in the mirror and said to yourself, I thought I'd be healthier, in better shape, feel better both physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and be further along in my life? If so, come on this journey with my dad as he explores all things health and wellness from a holistic medical perspective, even as a classically trained physician. He'll share integrative strategies to optimize health and inspire you to join the modern medicine movement.
Welcome, everyone, to the modern medicine movement. And a big aloha from Hawaii. Dr. Thomas Hemingway here. Super pumped, super excited, super grateful for you guys. Oh my gosh, just a big mahalo, Hawaiian. Thank you for listening. At this point, we've just had thousands and thousands of downloads, and this is just humbling to me, guys. I just so grateful. This just tells me that you're finding value, you're taking time out for yourselves and your health, and this just tickles my heart. Just love you guys. Thank you for listening. I'm just so humbled to be here with you and just appreciate you and appreciate your feedback. It's just, keeps me going, keeps me pumped up. And in fact, I wanted to read with you one of the recent reviews that I got here on the show. It's from Nurse Rose. Nurse Rose says, Dr. Hemingway has done so much research and is passionate about sharing the truth about many health conditions. Great information and totally worth the time to listen and learn. Thank you, Nurse Rose, for that 5-star review and for the comments. So grateful for you. And if you guys haven't already, I know many of you haven't. We've had, thousands and thousands of downloads and I think like 60-something reviews. So it's super easy to do. Just go to the show, scroll down at the end of the episodes. There's this area called ratings and review. There's 5 stars there. Click on the star farthest to the right. That's 5-star. And then there's a little link that will say write a review just below the stars. Click on that, type up a quick review, hit submit. Ba-bam! It's that easy. Thank you for doing that. It just helps get the show out there, help people to find it more easily. We can spread the good word, just get this good information out there because, as they say, common sense is not necessarily common practice. And I know a lot of the things that I share are not necessarily well known throughout the health world. I know from a physician perspective, a lot of physicians don't know all this stuff, and a lot of the lay people don't either. A lot of us just don't know it. And it's not that we're trying to, be uninformed. It's just sometimes there's other things that get in the way. There's other agendas. There's other things that are coming out through the media telling us to believe this or believe that. And so it's not always easy to find unbiased information. And so keep on this journey, keep listening, keep sharing. Please give me some feedback. Especially on Apple Podcasts, really helps the show. And thank you in advance. Awesome, guys. And also, if you haven't heard about our new private Facebook group, well, now you have. It's called the Modern Medicine Movement Health and Wellness Group, and you'll see links to my podcast. I'll also post some other information, some lives that I'll do from time to time, either by myself or my wife and I like to go live together. She's a nurse and also has a bachelor's, besides in nursing, but in kinesiology, movement, and exercise. She's just all things health. She's into it. We have a fun exchange every time we go live. And if you haven't watched them thus far, I usually try to post them up besides on my regular Facebook page, on my Modern Medicine Movement page and group, because they're a lot of fun and we have a lot of useful information there. So you can also reach out to me at Modern Medicine Movement through the Instagram there, or at Aloha Surf Doc, or just email me. That's probably The easiest way to ask your questions, I look at my email every day. I'm kind of old school. And it's Modern Medicine Movement Podcast at Gmail. So the whole thing, Modern Medicine Movement Podcast at Gmail. Reach out to me, ask me questions, or just tell me feedback, or just tell me what you want to learn about, what kind of topics you're interested in. I actually really appreciate your questions. Sometimes I'm thinking about, what'll I, podcast about this week? And I love to have, a list of things that you guys want to know. So don't be shy. Shoot me an email, shoot me a comment on Apple Podcasts. I'm happy to share with you what you guys are interested in. And, this week, it's been a crazy week. We've had a lot going on here at the house. We got everybody here. My wife and the 6 kids have been back. I think they've been home 3.5 weeks. And so they were able to survive the 14-day quarantine here at the house. And now they've been out and about. My kids have been surfing with me, and, we've been bike riding, doing some mountain bike stuff, which they're super amazing at. They're teaching the old guy here some new tricks, and that's been awesome. And, last week of the month, we've been, super busy with work and my wife's business and her team and sharing health and wellness. It's been a crazy week. And, I did this podcast, and we've had the worst internet lately. And so couldn't get it out to you guys right away. We just had lots of small island struggles with being in a rural place where the internet is spotty. And geez, it's been frustrating. I've been trying to get this thing uploaded as well as my kids' podcast. They have I got 2 boys that do podcasts every week. One of them actually does 2 podcasts per week. It's just crazy. Got lots of podcasts trying to go up, and just bad internet. So hopefully you get this real soon. But just exciting, fun, super interesting topic this week. And I can't wait to share it with you, because, the more we know, I think the better choices we can make. We can live better, and then we can take action, right? I mean, and the way I look at things, especially with health, is it just doesn't have to be that complicated. Because as, many would say, I don't know if it's Tony Robbins or who said this, but I've heard it often, complexity is the enemy of execution. Let's not make things overly complicated. And knowledge is not necessarily power, Like I learned back in the day with the G.I. Joe series, knowledge is power. Well, without execution, it doesn't do a lot for us. Execution, I would say, is the power. And the way I like to look at it is from a lesson I learned, I think it was like in 3rd or 4th grade, the so-called KISS method. I'm sure a lot of you guys remember this. I doubt they teach it anymore, because according to my kids, it uses the ST word, which, keep it simple. Let's just say Sam. Keep it simple, Sam. But we learned it as keep it simple, stupid, right? And I try not to use that word around my kids and stuff. So we'll just say the KISS method, keep it simple, Sam, right? So anyway, I try to keep things pretty simple, straightforward. I don't like complicated, long lists of things. I want something that's doable, reproducible, that we can, really take it and apply it to our lives, where the proverbial, rubber meets the road. I don't want it to be complicated. So today's topic, I think at the end of the day, the goal is, to be both enlightened, to learn, and probably a little bit of humor. You might laugh a little bit. You find some things pretty interesting. And then, I'll make some recommendations, which are actually pretty dang simple. So anyway, today's topic, I personally have just enjoyed learning more and more about not only, the science, which I knew pretty well, but just the history behind really what I think many of us will find pretty surprising behind, let's just call them the vegetable oils, or the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the PUFAs. But this is a topic that, I think probably for many reasons we haven't really known the truth of it because of, the big business that's involved here, right? The makers of these products don't necessarily want us to know these things, because they want us to keep buying them, and even though they may not be awesome for us. So let's try to step back. I could make all kinds of potential, corollaries to why I think this might be the case between sort of the big business, the government, the USDA, all this kind of stuff, much akin to big pharma and its ties with the government. I think the food industry and the USDA have ties with a lot of these things through the big business and through, the money that goes back and forth and all that. But let's just try to take a, what we might call the 30,000-foot view and get some perspective on how this all came to be. And, I think thinking about this, with the perspective that we as humans, having been around for thousands and thousands of years, have really only consumed vegetable oils for literally a couple of seconds in the 24-hour day, if you will, of human existence. So it's a very new thing. We never had these in our diet before, and so we might think about how it all plays in, because really before 100 years ago, we didn't really consume much, if any, of these vegetable oils, because as you'll find out soon, it's not something you could get a hold of very easily, actually. The process through which these vegetable oils are manufactured was certainly not something our ancestors could have done, because it requires not only lots of different chemicals, but machinery and all these things. And we as humans, we actually used to eat, believe it or not, simple, whole foods, right? Both animal and plant foods that were simple, real, and whole, that didn't need a bunch of processing, right? If we wanted to cook something, well, we'd probably cook the meat first and then the drippings we could use, to cook something else, like, maybe eggs or what have you. And even a couple hundred years ago, believe it or not, they had cookbooks back in the 1800s, and although they did have already at that time things like sugar and flour, the whole population, or the majority of them, was not obese, was not having heart disease and heart attacks, even though they already had flour and sugar. But they actually used real butter, lard, tallow, all these things that just came from animals that were simple, whole fats, the saturated fats, if you will. And guess what? Nobody was dying of heart disease. They weren't. They really weren't. Heart disease is a thing of recent years, really, and it's kind of correlated pretty directly with the use of the PUFAs, or the polyunsaturated fatty acids, or the vegetable oils. And so it's pretty interesting historically how all these things come into play, and what we as a society had been taught by our very own government, right? Even not only the USDA, but as well as the American Heart Association. It's been pretty interesting how you might, look at this. So let me just present kind of the history behind it, and you can decide for yourself how this plays in. But first of all, vegetable oils primarily contain what are called polyunsaturated fats, or the PUFAs. I've already kind of alluded to this. And what is that? What does that mean? Well, in pretty simple chemical terms, that just means that they have more than one double bond. So poly is more than one, right? And unsaturated is referring to the double bonds, which just means that they're missing some hydrogens there. So they're unsaturated. If they were saturated, then they wouldn't have all these double bonds, okay? And the double bonds are actually not awesome, because it just makes them more prone to oxidation and being injured, damaged, releasing, free radicals, and they basically can just cause a whole downstream effect of inflammation in the body. Remember how we've talked about oxidation? We talked about it with respect to the LDL particle, and how it's not the LDL per se, but when it gets oxidized, then it can cause trouble. And so same kind of thing here. The polyunsaturated fatty acids are super prone to oxidation because of all these double bonds. and they just, heat can do it, light, really almost anything can make them react and become oxidized. And so the polyunsaturated fatty acids, or the PUFAs, aren't awesome because they're not that stable in the body, whereas the saturated fats are, and they aren't as prone to this oxidation. So anyway, that's just kind of the simple science of it. When they originally discovered probably the most famous of these polyunsaturated fatty acids, which was Crisco, it's just fascinating. I got to share with you a little bit of this history because it's just kind of mind-boggling. I mean, when you think about it, you know how the saying goes, one man's junk is another man's treasure. Well, Crisco was certainly junk before it was developed, and still, I would argue, is still junk. But basically, it was made from a waste product of the cotton processing. So cotton, as we know, really got popularized as we, were able to manufacture it much more easily when Eli Whitney, made the cotton gin, which basically took from a couple 100,000 pounds a year that we were able to produce to literally millions and millions of pounds of cotton after 1793, when Eli Whitney basically was able to make the cotton gin there. And so in the process, I don't know if you guys have ever seen cotton. I personally have. You have, the cotton fiber, the kind of fluffy stuff. And then you got these little tiny seeds. And these little seeds are basically useless. Until Procter & Gamble got a hold of this new technology, if you will. But for every 100 pounds of fiber, of the cotton, there was actually, believe it or not, that's the light fluffy stuff, there was 162 pounds of the cotton seeds. So there were actually more by weight of these seeds than fiber, and they were basically useless because in order to just replace themselves, if you will, they only needed about 5% of this seed to replant. And so the other 95% were basically garbage. They tried to feed it to the livestock, but this wasn't awesome. They didn't really like it. It wasn't good food anyway. Most of it was just kind of left out to rot, or it was just dumped illegally into rivers. It was basically just a waste product. But then in the 1820s, 30s or so, they were needing more oil for cooking, and they had these lamps that they needed oil for. And so some entrepreneurs of that time figured out how to crush those worthless cotton seeds and extract the oil. But it wasn't really an easy process. But they were able to get the oil out, and they started to sell it and use it for lamps and things like that because they couldn't even imagine it being a food product because it was kind of a discolored, cloudy, orangey looking oil. It had a funny smell, and so they didn't really even think of it for food. But later, around the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, the Procter & Gamble company was able to figure out how to make this into this kind of white, waxy, shiny substance. I think it was 1910, which they gave the name Crisco, and it was a hydrogenated cottonseed oil. So literally, this was the waste product of the whole cotton manufacturing process. And through the technology of the time, they were able to heat it up, use extreme pressures. Then they kind of bleached out the bad odors, and they used a deodorizing process, and all this stuff to get it to this clean-looking, shiny, white stuff that we know as Crisco. And in 1911, they debuted this product, and they introduced it at that time as the quote-unquote ideal fat because of its quote-unquote purity, right? And they said it's all natural, it's all vegetable. And guess what? Their marketing, well, it worked. It worked like crazy. The other thing that I thought was an unbelievably effective plan is that they actually produced a cookbook, right, full of recipes that could use Crisco instead of the traditional animal lard that everybody used before that, and butter and so on. But when they, came out with this new product, they actually put it in a cookbook. And this recipe book, they gave it away for free. And in those days, nobody gave away books for free. So people were getting these free cookbooks that showed how to use Crisco. And it was telling them that, oh my gosh, it's so much better for you. Look at it. It's so shiny and clean. It's pure. It's all vegetable. It's crazy, the marketing that went into this. And plus, it was cheaper than getting the fat from the lard and the tallow and butter and all that. It was just a cheaper thing. And so guess what? Well, it sold like mad. And because of that, us humans, we were eating that stuff up. Even my grandparents used Crisco, and it's a travesty. That stuff is horrible, horrible, horrible. I hope we have time later. I'll tell you about the whole processing. It'll blow your mind. If you want to just watch a couple, there's lots of YouTube videos on the processing of how you get Crisco out of these tiny little cotton seeds. And if you've ever seen one of these things, you would look at it and there's these little tiny dried out seeds. You would say there's no way they're going to be able to get any kind of oil out of this thing. Like, holy crap, how is that even possible? Well, watch the many and sundry YouTube videos of how this can happen, and it'll blow your mind, because despite the marketing taglines of it being ideal and pure and all vegetable, there's nothing about this process that is, quote unquote, pure or healthy. I mean, it's just unbelievable. But anyway, this Crisco, or this sort of original polyunsaturated fatty acid or vegetable oil, was really taking off in the early 1900s. It got incorporated into many of our diets, and literally its use skyrocketed, and it basically paralleled the uptick in coronary artery disease. But guess what? Nobody wanted to recognize that, because Procter & Gamble was, yeah, you guessed it, given money to the government, given money to the American Heart Association. In fact, when the American Heart Association started in the early 1900s, it was really just a couple of cardiologists, having like roundtable discussions and so on. It wasn't big until it got, over $1 million from Procter & Gamble. So you draw your own conclusions. The American Heart Association started to get big right about the time it got this giant $1.5 million donation in 1948 from Procter & Gamble, who is, of course, the manufacturer of Crisco. And then there was a guy by the name of Ancel Keys. And if you haven't heard about this guy, wow, lots of drama. He was basically the guy who single-handedly was able to, propagate the myth that saturated fat led to heart disease, right? This thing that we've been eating for literally thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years as humans, never having any issues with heart disease until recent years when these vegetable oils became incorporated into our diet. Yet Ancel Keys decided to hypothesize this whole thing called the lipid hypothesis, and basically make the villain the saturated fat, right? Because of course it has to be the saturated fat. Well, it's an interesting story. I don't have time to share the whole thing, but basically he set out to find, data, if you will, that agreed with what his hypothesis was. And if the data did not agree with his hypothesis, guess what he did? Like any good scientist, he just ignored it. Well, I wouldn't say that's a good scientist, but too often, at least historically, when these studies and things have been done, the stuff that people don't agree with, they just throw it out. They don't even report it until recently, where, the trials are required to report even negative trials or harmful ones, whereas in the past, they could just kind of sweep that stuff under the rug. It's just unbelievable. So Ancel Keys, oh my gosh, this guy was, he had a mission, and it was not to propagate truth. It was to propagate his own hypothesis that saturated fat leads to heart disease, which is not what the data shows. Because, he would go out and try to find locations that had high levels of folks with saturated fat, like in the U.S., right? And say, oh, well, or high levels of heart disease, I should say, it must be the saturated fat they're eating. Whereas, let's take Japan, for example. They don't eat all the saturated fat, and they're not getting heart disease. Well, they're also not eating all the sugar, all the processed foods, the daily caloric intake of our Japanese folks was way less than the American folks, and so they were just eating less calories. I mean, there's all these other differences. And then a country like France, for example, that eats tons of saturated fats, they, guess what, didn't have much heart disease either, but he decided to leave that out completely. I think this was alluded to at one time as the French paradox. There's other, countries that also had high saturated fat diets and were not having heart attacks, but he decided to just ignore all this stuff, right? And since we've also learned about other communities where they literally eat almost nothing but saturated fat, like the Inuit tribes of the Eskimos, the Maasai peoples in Africa, where they essentially eat a diet preponderantly full of saturated fats, and literally no one is dying of heart disease. So this hypothesis, there's lots of data out there. I just don't have time to really get into all of it. There's a couple of amazing books out there that talk about this. I would encourage you to take a look. One is a guy I really like a lot, Dr. Joseph Mercola. He wrote, of course, the book Fat for Fuel. I've alluded to this in previous podcasts. He gives a nice discussion about this, as well as a newer book that I recently became familiar with and read that is just super fascinating, that has probably some of the best investigative journalism I've ever seen. And that is called The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. If you haven't heard about this, I'd recommend you read it or get it on Audible. Fascinating stuff. And what's cool about her is, she was one of these people like many of us that was trying to adhere to all the usual guidelines by, the FDA and so on, to eat less fat, and she just never could figure out why she couldn't lose that 10 pounds that she wanted to lose. And she was at the time, I think, she was a journalist for a newspaper and had a column where she would give reviews on restaurants and things. And so she got to eat at different restaurants. And what she found is that she was eating all this super rich food, high in saturated fat. And at the end of the day, she actually lost weight. And it was crazy. She just couldn't even believe it. It didn't even make sense to her. And she started doing all this research into saturated fats and trying to figure out what was going on. And this led her on a 10-year quest for basically all the data she could find. A lot of it she had to dig up that was kind of hidden by guys like Ansel Keys that didn't want to report the things that went against his lipid hypothesis. So super fascinating book, The Big Fat Surprise, Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet by Nina Teicholz. Once again, Fat for Fuel, Joseph Mercola. Definitely take a look at these books, get them on Audible. It's a cool way to listen to it in your net time, right? Like Tony Robbins says, the no extra time. Just fascinating stuff. But just to kind of summarize, as I mentioned, American Heart Disease or Heart Association took off basically after its large donation in 1948 by Procter & Gamble, the makers of Crisco, $1.5 million, right? Which in those days, $1.5 million, what was that? Like 70 years ago was tons and tons of money, more than they had ever seen. And basically they, with Ansel Keys and his work, made the villain saturated fat. And that just sent us on this 50, almost 70-year journey now where the enemy of all times, right, is saturated fat, according to the USDA, according to the American Heart Association. And it's super interesting when you read about this. I didn't really think much about it, but way back in the day, you go to the movie theaters, get some popcorn, and they actually fried it in animal fat, which actually would have been better and more healthier looking back. But once this stuff came out with Ansel Keys and how saturated fat supposedly was causing heart disease, that they changed all that. And then, of course, nowadays, right, they've been frying everything in these vegetable oils, which are really these PUFAs or trans fats, which now we know are actually the culprit in a lot of the heart disease out there. Because what's happened in the last 50 to 70 years when we've had this huge uptick on consuming the PUFAs or the polyunsaturated fatty acids or all these vegetable oils, well, has heart disease gotten any less in our country, in the U.S. I'm referring to especially? Absolutely freaking not. In fact, even though people are eating a lot less saturated fat than they used to, the heart disease continues to go up and has been postulated that it will continue to go up. And I think that a lot of the reason is because of these trans fats, because of these polyunsaturated fats, all these vegetable oils, which quote unquote sound healthy. In fact, they were even purported by the American Heart Association to be, quote, heart healthy and recommended to us. And finally, I think in 2013, they were able to finally say, you know what? They're probably not awesome. You know, these hydrogenated oils, they actually took them off their list of recognized as safe, although they had been on there for decades and decades, and we were actually told to consume these things. So if you ever see in an ingredient, besides the oils that I'll talk about a little bit more in detail later, things like cottonseed oil, safflower oil, canola oil, oh my gosh, sunflower oil, peanut oil, all these kinds of oils, these are not the good ones. These are not the ones you want. They are not the ones you can easily get by just pressing the vegetable. Like olive oil, for example, it's actually fine. It's simply processed. You just squeeze it right, you get the oil out of it. Same thing with coconut oil. It's just pressed. Avocado oil, pressed. But all these others that I mentioned just previous, you have to go through these super, long, drawn-out processes through high pressure, high heat, lots of chemicals to get oil out of something like the rape seed. Have you ever heard of a rape, R-A-P-E, rape seed? Well, you know what that is? That is actually what canola oil comes from. Canola sounds a lot better, doesn't it? Sounds like it could be healthy. Well, because of the PUFAs and how they're prone to oxidation and causing free radicals, not awesome because they cause inflammation in our body. And I would suggest to you that likely they are part of the reason, besides all the other processed garbage, that's probably causing us as a society to have an uptick in not only being overweight, obesity, diabetes, but heart disease as well, So try to avoid these processed vegetable oils and stick to the healthy ones. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But this history is so fascinating. And it wasn't until recently that the AHA said, okay, I guess maybe we were a little bit wrong. They didn't even say that, but they took the hydrogenated oils off their list of probably safe foods, right? So if they finally did this, I mean, it was a long time coming, but look at labels. If you ever see hydrogenated in there, like avoid that stuff like the plague. These are the trans fats that are definitely shown to increase heart disease. Anything that's sort of these margarines, these kind of fake butters and so on, Criscos, they all have hydrogenated vegetable oils in there. They're not awesome. They're an omega-6 oil. I'll just talk briefly about this. Basically, throughout human history, we haven't traditionally consumed much of these omega-6 oils because they're actually kind of hard to find in nature. You can get them out of certain nuts, but these omega-6 ones are much more inflammatory than the omega-3 counterpart. The omega-3 is actually much better for us. Those are the ones found from fish. The fish oils, the cod liver oil traditionally has been the one that we've always kind of used as the poster child for the omega-3, which is the more healthy one. That's the one that these Inuit folks in Alaska, they're having lots of this through their saturated fat diet once again, and that's the omega-3s have been shown to do all kinds of great stuff for us, improve our cholesterol panels, improve our brain health. They're not real inflammatory like the omega-6 is, and really we should have at least as much omega-3 in our diet as omega-6, but the converse is true in almost all of us because of these processed vegetable oils, which are high in the omega-6 or the linoleic acid, which is not awesome because they're way more inflammatory. They're way more susceptible to oxidation because upon exposure to heat and light and air, through cooking as well as just through the processing of this stuff, they really get adulterated very easily and super, super duper inflammatory. So watch out for that. Anything that says hydrogenated oil, what have you, avoid it like the plague. All of those vegetable oils that I mentioned they're not natural, I'll tell you that. These are not ones we should be eating. Safflower, canola, certainly not the Wesson, the cottonseed oil. I mean, this stuff is just literally garbage. So stay away from that stuff. Grapeseed oil, no good. Even sesame oil, walnut oil, canola oil, peanut oil. None of these are that awesome because they have a super high percentage of the PUFAs, the omega-6 type, which is not awesome. Olive oil, just to give you an example, the converse of that, which I would advocate as a healthy oil, only has about 9% of the omega-6, whereas, for example, grapeseed oil, 70%, sesame oil, 42%, walnut oil, 54%. And so try to, stick to things like olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil. Those are probably the big three that I use in my cooking. And then just stuff like butter. And you can use bacon grease. The traditional beef tallow, for example, had only 3% of the omega-6. Butter, only 3%. Coconut oil, only 1.9%. So this is omega-6 is the one you don't want to have a lot of because it's more inflammatory. And so those are the ones that have a low percentage. Coconut oil, and then the natural butters, beef tallow as well. And like I said, olive oil, avocado oil as well. So we go back full circle to what I've talked about many times, is that the recommendation is for real, whole food, like stuff that comes from real animals, real plants, not stuff that was pressed in a machine at high pressures, that was bleached and deodorized and all of that, right? Not good. And let me just talk a little bit about just saturated fat, for example, because I think, this myth that Ansel Keys got started, that saturated fat was the enemy, has really not panned out, not with the data, not with the time. And like I said, he just ignored the evidence that didn't agree with him, and there's actually a lot of evidence that didn't agree with him. And then there's been a lot of newer data that certainly supports that saturated fat. Not only is it not bad for you, but it's actually good for you, right? It's amazing, right? We've gone full circle. Like now it's fine to eat butter, right? Well, it should be fine. I don't know. Not everybody professes that, but it's actually fine. Saturated fat is useful. Does a lot of good things for us. You want to hear a couple of them? Well, the saturated fat is how fat is primarily found in our bodies. 90 some odd percent of the fat that is incorporated into things like our cell membranes, our hormones, fat-soluble vitamins and whatnot. This is actually saturated fat without all these double bonds that we talked about in these processed ones, the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Those are unstable, and when those get incorporated into our membranes because we're eating a diet full of processed foods or just things that have vegetable oils in them, those actually get incorporated into our cell membranes and make those cells more susceptible to injury, oxidation, and so on. So that's not good. But the saturated fats, those are fine. Those are actually the ones that naturally we use in our own cell membranes. They're the building blocks, as we've talked about previously, for our cell membranes, for our hormones. They also help with mineral absorption, like calcium, for example. They are carriers for lots of important vitamins, like the fat-soluble ones, vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin K, vitamin E. They can also help with the conversion of carotene into vitamin A. And there are some, like the palmitic oils, that can lower cholesterol levels. Some even have antiviral properties. And of course, we've talked about this previously, but they're good for our brain. These saturated fats are good for our brain. Our brain is actually mostly fat. And I think I mentioned that in my brain health podcast. Not only that, but what Nina Teicholz, the lady that wrote The Big Fat Liar, or what I mentioned earlier, she noticed in her own experience that once she was eating more fatty foods, guess what? She got more full. She got more satiated, which meant for her that, she didn't snack between meals anymore because she had a high-fat meal at a fancy restaurant where they served maybe ribeye, and previous she might have been just eating, lean chicken or something. She wasn't getting hungry between meals. So at the end of the day, she was actually eating less calories. Also, what else can saturated fat do for you? Well, it can improve our HDL. And although it may increase the LDL a little bit, it's actually the good kind of LDL, the large, fluffy LDL, not the dense kind that goes up with the vegetable oil consumption. So not only does it increase your good cholesterol or the HDL, but there's a little bit of an uptick on LDL, which is actually just fine because it's the large, fluffy LDL variety, which unfortunately in the lab, people almost never measure. So they say, oh my gosh, your LDL is elevated. Well, we're not getting the whole picture here. Also, of course, the fat serves as an amazing fuel for our body. We can survive much longer on fats than on simple glucose. Also, glucose, this big sort of lie that we've been told for years and years and years that we got to have glucose, we got to have glucose, we got to have glucose because it's energy, it's energy. Well, guess what? The more glucose or sugary foods that we eat, the more insulin our pancreas secretes. And what does insulin do? It tells our body to store more fat. So that's part of the reason a lot of us can't get rid of that extra weight. We probably have a too heavily carbohydrate diet. When we convert that to a higher fat percentage, not only will we be satiated earlier and feel full and eat less, but actually we will not be telling our body to store more fat. We'll actually be using the fat. So saturated fat is actually just fine. And the science also agrees with that. It agrees with that. There's been at least 6 major clinical trials recently that have been shown to support that saturated fats are good for us. They're not actually causing us to die younger of heart disease. That was Ansel Keys' hypothesis, which he tried very hard to propagate. And he was super successful propagating that, but unfortunately, it's not true. Well, fortunately for us, because I actually think not only does saturated fat just simply taste better, but of course it's natural. It doesn't go through this super convoluted processing that the PUFAs go through, that like the corn oils and the sunflower oils and the canola oils and all these things. The processing is ridiculous. And so we need to try to avoid these type of oils in our diet, especially anything on the label that says hydrogenated, even though they'll tell us, quote unquote, and I guess still legally, that it's all natural. There is nothing natural about the processing of these oils. I mean, think about that cottonseed example from over 100 years ago. How the heck did they even get oil out of that stuff? I mean, the fact that we design processes to even extract oil out of essentially this garbage seed is incredible to me. Just incredible. I mean, they have these just machinery, this fully pressurized, hydrogen gas reactor that can do this. And then, soap-like emulsifiers, deodorizers, all this stuff that goes through this process. And then they have to try to get rid of that nasty rancid taste. I mean, it's just bleached and dyed and then artificially flavored. And yet at the end of the day, they call it all natural. I mean, I'll be honest, 10 years ago, I thought canola oil was just fine. Like, I bought canola oil like probably most of us have, and maybe some of us still do, but I won't buy it anymore. I'll tell you that. Absolutely freaking not. I mean, some of the worst offenders. And yet, this is what was fed to us for years and years and years, starting with 1911. Thank you very much, Procter & Gamble. Crisco, who took literally garbage and made it that shiny white stuff that our grandparents started to incorporate into their baking, and made those cookies nice and made things, look nice and whatnot. So stay away from that stuff. It's horrible, horrible, horrible for you, super inflammatory, and it's just anything but natural. So take a look on maybe some of these videos out there on the processing of the vegetable oils. It will blow your mind. And remember that there are healthy alternatives out there, stuff like coconut oil. How about just real butter, right? We can do what my parents used to do, is cook some bacon, and then the drippings, they would let it, they pour it into a glass jar, and then they use that later to cook from. I mean, that's fine too. That's basically, like the beef tallow that people would buy. That it's hard to get that stuff anymore. But coconut oil, I cook a lot with that. I cook a lot with avocado oil, olive oil. Those are sort of my staples. MCT oil is fine. Obviously I'm a proponent of eating whole foods. Eggs, I love eggs. Dr. Mercola loves eggs. He loves avocados. I love avocados. It's simple. Let's go to eating real whole food. And if we do eat meat like I do, I don't eat it every day, but I love me a good ribeye. I just cooked some up the other day for our Father's Day, and it was amazing. Make sure we're buying it from, good ranches where they don't feed their animals corn and GMO processed garbage. Make sure we're getting grass-fed beef, because it actually does matter. It does matter what the animals we eat, like be it beef or chicken or what have you. If these animals that we're eating have been fed garbage stuff, like remember how I said they were trying to use the cotton seed as feed for animals? If they're eating this GMO stuff, like basically canola oil, I've never even heard of being able to make that stuff without GMO. It's basically all GMO. If they feed that stuff, or the GMO corn, they feed that stuff to the animals, and then they slaughter the animals, and we eat that steak or chicken or whatever it is, we're getting that stuff as well, even though you don't think about it. So it's not only important what we eat, but it's important what the animals that we're eating have eaten. And we don't think about that. I know I hadn't thought about that until recent years. I make sure to always buy grass-fed beef, wild-caught fish. This is just much better than farmed stuff. It really is. It's amazing how different it is. Yes, it might cost a little bit more, but hey, we only got one body. Let's treat it well. Let's put the best high-quality ingredients into it, which is basically whole natural foods, not the crap that Procter & Gamble got us hooked on 100 years ago. So anyway, fascinating stuff. It's just, it'll blow your mind the more you read about it, the more you learn about it. It's not what you once thought. The American Heart Association, did you know that? They got millions of dollars from Procter & Gamble. I mean, it's just crazy. Who knew, right? Well, now you do. Ansel Keys, not a good dude. So his agenda is what became the American Heart and the USDA and the nutrition guidelines, which are super flawed, that said eat a low-fat diet with very little saturated fat. Garbage. They're finally slowly improving that, but unfortunately I think a lot of that is stuck with us, and a lot of us are fearful of saturated fats, and we shouldn't be. So anyway, pure, real, whole food, avocado oil, coconut oil, and then just butter, lard, tallow, Palm oil is okay too if it's sustainably sourced. Read Mercola's book if you haven't. Read Nina Teicholz's book. It's amazing. I've just really enjoyed that. But The Big Fat Surprise, I'll put both of those in the show notes. And at the end of the day, just stick to the real, natural, normal, whole food. You can't go wrong. And the more you know, hopefully the more that you'll be able to incorporate these things into your lives. And so eat real, eat whole, natural, healthy foods, both plant and animal. I'm certainly an omnivore. I eat a little bit of everything, and I try to avoid the processed stuff and certainly these oils that we've been told are fine for years and years and years, they are not fine. Anything hydrogenated, throw it out. Any of these canola oils, vegetable oils, certainly Crisco, throw it out. It's inflammatory. These are the causes of heart disease and many of the chronic illnesses out there because they're so easily oxidized, so easily damaged, and that just causes inflammation, which causes chronic disease, which is what we want to avoid. So eat healthy, eat real, eat natural, and saturated fat, like the cholesterol I mentioned several podcasts ago, is not the enemy. We actually need that stuff. We need the normal stuff, not the stuff with double bonds, not the PUFAs. We need the normal saturated fat to incorporate into our membranes, and we will be healthier, happier, and who knows, you might just like Nina Heicholz herself lose that extra stubborn 10 pounds through eating saturated fat. Who knew? Anyway, love you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Just share this stuff, incorporate it into your life, and live better. Aloha.